The night of July 11th, 1943. Off the coast of Sicily, the Mediterranean stretched black and calm under a nearly full moon. Aboard the destroyer USS Davison, Captain James Frederick Parr stood on the bridge watching the horizon. At 2300 hours, a voice crackled over the radio. The admiral in charge of the invasion fleet. His message was clear, urgent, repeated twice. Paratroopers, approaching from the south. They are friendly. Repeat, they are friendly. Parr relayed the message to his gun crews. Then he waited, scanning the southern sky. 3 minutes passed. 4. Then, somewhere in the darkness below decks, a radio operator's voice cut through the static. Young, panicked, breaking protocol. Friendly hell, they just dropped a stick on me. And the world exploded. Every gun in the Allied fleet opened fire at once. 5-inch shells tore upward into the darkness, proximity fuses detonating in brilliant white bursts that turned night into flickering. Parr watched, frozen, as the sky filled with tracers, green and yellow and red, streaming upward in dense curtains of fire. He could see them now, the aircraft, Douglas C-47 Skytrains. Twin-engine transports, unmistakable in their silhouette, American, carrying American paratroopers of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And they were being torn apart. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The first transport exploded in mid-air, a sudden orange bloom that scattered debris and bodies across 200 yards of sky. Another caught fire, its left wing shearing away, spiraling toward the water-trailing flame. Parr saw figures tumbling from the open cargo doors. Some on fire, some tangled in parachute rigging that would never deploy. Others making it out, deploying their chutes, only to drift helplessly down through the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire, while the ships below kept shooting. It lasted 20 minutes. 20 minutes of sustained fire from every vessel in the invasion fleet. When it ended, 23 C-47 seconds had been destroyed. 37 more limped away with catastrophic damage. 60 aircrew members dead. 229 paratroopers killed by friendly fire. Some shot out of the sky. Some drowned in the Mediterranean, dragged under by 100 pounds of equipment before they could release their harnesses. And on the beach at Gela, 3 men watched it happen. Lieutenant General George Patton, commander of the 7th Army, Major General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, and Brigadier General Omar Bradley. They stood in the open, transfixed, unable to move, unable to stop it, watching their own forces slaughter their own men. Ridgway would later call it the darkest night of the war. Patton, who rarely showed emotion, stood speechless. Bradley wrote that it felt like watching, a nightmare from which you cannot wake. They had sent those men. They had approved the mission. And now those men were falling from the sky in pieces. This is the story of how that disaster was never allowed to happen again. How a solution so simple it seemed absurd, so obvious it had been overlooked for years, saved thousands of lives. How, in the space of 48 hours before the largest airborne operation in history, a few hundred ground crewmen with paintbrushes and improvised tools transformed every Allied aircraft in Britain. And how that transformation, born from catastrophe, became one of the most recognizable symbols of victory in the Second World War. But to understand what happened in those 48 hours, you must first understand what happened in the 20 minutes over Sicily. And to understand that, you must go back further still, to the problem that no one in the Allied command had thought to solve. By the summer of 1943, the Allied war machine faced a paradox. For the first time since the fall of France, they possessed overwhelming air superiority. In North Africa, the Luftwaffe had been driven from the skies. Over the Mediterranean, Allied fighters roamed unopposed. The industrial capacity of Britain and America produced aircraft at a rate Germany could not match. 10,000 fighters, 8,000 bombers, thousands more transport planes, reconnaissance aircraft, gliders. But superiority created its own problem. The more aircraft you had, the harder they were to identify. In daylight, at close range, aircraft recognition was straightforward. Every pilot, every gunner, every infantryman received training on silhouettes, wing configurations, engine types. German aircraft looked different from Allied aircraft, usually, but not always. The Junkers Ju-88 bomber, a twin-engine medium bomber, had a silhouette remarkably similar to the C-47 Skytrain. Same wingspan, same engine configuration, same approximate size. In combat, aircraft did not appear at close range in good light. They appeared as distant specks moving at 200 miles per hour. They appeared in dawn, twilight, or dusk shadow. They appeared at night, backlit by searchlights or muzzle flash. They appeared in weather, through cloud, through smoke, through the visual chaos of battle where seconds mattered and mistakes meant death. The Allies had a technical solution. Identification. Friend or foe, IFF. A transponder system. Each Allied aircraft carried a device that, when interrogated by radar, would transmit a coded signal identifying it as friendly. In theory, perfect. In practice, limited. IFF worked when radar operators had time to interrogate each target, when the number of targets remained manageable. When the system didn't fail due to damage, malfunction, or simple human error. Over Sicily on the night of July 11th, IFF became irrelevant. The German Luftwaffe had attacked the invasion fleet less than an hour before the sigh. American paratroopers arrived, Heinkel bombers, real enemies. They had sunk 3 vessels, damaged others, killed Allied sailors. Every gun crew in the fleet had just watched their ships burn. Their nerves were raw, their fingers were on triggers. Their training said, "Aircraft at night means enemy. Shoot first. Question later." When the C-47 seconds appeared, approaching from the south, low and slow, exactly matching the attack profile of German bombers, the gunners saw what they expected to see. Enemy aircraft. And they did what they were trained to do. They opened fire. By the time anyone realized the mistake, over 100 men were already dead. The Board of Inquiry convened 3 days later. They interviewed witnesses, collected reports, analyzed radio logs. Their findings were damning and inconclusive in equal measure. No one could determine with certainty whether the Navy or the Army had fired first. Multiple gunners claimed they saw bomb bay doors opening, saw ordnance falling. These claims were false. The C-47 seconds carried no bombs. What the gunners saw were cargo doors opening, paratroopers preparing to jump. Some ships claimed they never received the warning message. Others admitted receiving it but said 12 hours' notice was insufficient to guarantee every gunner on every vessel understood the order. The paratroopers carried yellow recognition lights on their aircraft bellies. The gunners either did not see them or did not understand their significance. The paratroopers used the password Ulysses, Grant. The ground troops used Think, Quickly. When survivors landed and attempted to identify themselves, they were fired upon by their own infantry. Every point of failure was documented. Every recommendation was made. Better communication, better coordination, better training, all of it correct. None of it sufficient. Because the fundamental problem remained unsolved. In the chaos of combat, with hundreds of aircraft filling the sky, how do you tell friend from enemy fast enough to matter? The British had considered this problem before. In August 1942, during planning for the Dieppe raid, RAF planners worried that anti-aircraft gunners would mistake Spitfires for German fighters. They proposed painting vertical white stripes on the forward fuselage and tail fin of each aircraft. Distinctive, visible, instant recognition. The proposal was rejected. The raid proceeded without special markings. It failed for other reasons, but the idea was filed away, forgotten. After Sicily, the idea resurfaced. In August 1943, during Operation Starkey, a deception operation in the Pas de Calais, Allied aircraft were painted with alternating stripes, 2 black, 2 white, wrapped around the wings. It was a test. The aircraft were visible. The markings were distinctive. The Germans never took the bait. The operation taught nothing about combat effectiveness, but it proved the concept worked. Aircraft with bold, alternating stripes could be identified instantly, even at distance, even in poor conditions. The data went into files. Planning staffs took note. Somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, someone began drafting a memorandum. But memo writing takes time. Approvals take time. Procurement of thousands of gallons of paint takes time. And time, in the spring of 1944, was the one commodity the Allies did not possess. Because Operation Overlord was coming. The invasion of Normandy, D-Day, the largest amphibious assault in human history, and it would require more aircraft, carrying more men into more concentrated airspace than any operation ever conceived. The planning documents painted a picture that terrified every staff officer who read them. 11,500 Allied aircraft, 9,500 air attack and support aircraft on D-Day itself. Fighters, bombers, transports, gliders, photo reconnaissance, all converging on a 50-mile stretch of French coastline in a 12-hour window. The 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command would launch 14,000 sorties. The Allied Expeditionary Air Force would provide continuous fighter cover. The 9th Air Force Troop Carrier Command would deliver 13,000 paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Each wave of transport aircraft would pass over the invasion fleet. Each wave would be vulnerable to the same mistake that killed over 300 men over Sicily. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, read the reports from Sicily. He understood what they meant. If the friendly fire disaster repeated itself over Normandy, with 10 times the aircraft and 10 times the forces involved, the casualties would not be measured in hundreds, they would be measured in thousands. The invasion could fail before it began, not because of German resistance, because the Allies would destroy themselves. On April 18, 1944, a memorandum circulated from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Subject: Aircraft Identification. It stated that all Allied aircraft taking part in the invasion of Europe would be marked with 5 alternating stripes on both wings and rear fuselage, positioned to avoid covering national markings. 3 white stripes, 2 black stripes, 18 inches wide on single-engine aircraft, 24 inches wide on twin-engine and larger aircraft. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commanding the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, reviewed the proposal. He recognized its necessity. He also recognized its impossibility. Nearly 12,000 aircraft would require these markings. Each aircraft would need approximately 20 gallons of paint, 240,000 gallons total. Britain was already rationing paint for essential war production. Finding that quantity of black and white paint would require diverting resources from ship hulls, camouflage, identification markings, infrastructure. But the alternative was unacceptable. On May 17, 1944, Leigh-Mallory approved the memorandum. The order was official. Every Allied tactical aircraft in Britain would receive invasion stripes before D-Day. The order did not specify when. It did not provide a timeline. It simply stated the requirement. The details would come later. The details came on June 1st, 4 days before the scheduled invasion. A small-scale test was flown over the invasion fleet assembling in southern England. Aircraft with freshly painted stripes flew low passes over Royal Navy vessels. The purpose was familiarization. To let the ship's crews see the markings, understand what they meant, internalize the pattern. The test went well. The markings were visible. The ships held their fire. The concept was validated. But validation created urgency. Every day the stripes remained unpainted was a day the secret could leak. A day. German reconnaissance might photograph marked aircraft, and realize an invasion was imminent. The operational security demands of Overlord required that the markings go on at the last possible moment, late enough that German intelligence would have no time to react, early enough that Allied forces would have time to learn them. On June 3, 1944, the order went out to troop carrier units. 9th Air Force Troop Carrier Command, 38 troop carrier groups, 821 C-47 Skytrains, 300 Waco CG-4 gliders, every transport aircraft that would carry paratroopers or tow gliders into Normandy. Paint the stripes. You have 24 hours. On June 4th, the order went to fighter and bomber squadrons. 8th Air Force, 9th Air Force, Royal Air Force, Fighter Command, Bomber Command, Coastal Command, every tactical aircraft in Britain, thousands of Spitfires, Hurricanes, Typhoons, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings, B-26, Marauders, A-20 Havocs. Paint the stripes. You have 24 hours. D-Day is June 5th. Except D-Day was not June 5th. Weather forced a postponement. 24 hours became 48. But the order stood. The paint had to go on. And on airfields across southern England, ground crews who had never painted anything larger than a fuel tank stared at the parked aircraft and realized they had been handed an impossible task. The crews were mechanics, riggers, armourers, radio technicians, men trained to service engines and repair hydraulic systems and load ammunition. They were not painters. Most had never touched a paintbrush in a military context. The standard procedure for painting aircraft involved masking, priming, multiple coats, drying time, inspection, professional work done in controlled environments. What they were being asked to do was none of that. The specifications were clear but overwhelming. 5 stripes, each 18 to 24 inches wide depending on aircraft size. Alternating white, black, white, black, white. Applied to both wings, top and bottom. Applied to the rear fuselage, wrapping completely around. Do not cover national insignia. Do not cover identification codes. Do not interfere with control surfaces. Do not create drag or weight imbalance. And do it in 48 hours with however many men and whatever tools you can find. At RAF Station Tempsford in Bedfordshire, Sergeant Robert Mackenzie stood beside a line of C-47 seconds and did the mathematics. His squadron had 18 aircraft. Each required approximately 80 square feet of painted surface, 1,440 square feet total. His ground crew consisted of 12 men, none of them painters. And he had no brushes. The RAF supply depot at Tempsford had exactly 6 4-inch paintbrushes in inventory. They were intended for maintenance touch-up, not full aircraft coating. Mackenzie requisitioned them anyway, then he sent men to scrounge. The mess hall donated 3 mops. The medical section provided 2 deck brushes used for cleaning. The motor pool contributed roller brushes meant for road maintenance. One aircraft mechanic discovered that heavy cloth wrapped around a stick and soaked in paint worked better than any brush. Another found that applying paint with bare hands, spreading it thick and fast, covered surface area faster than any tool. At RAF Station North Witham, the situation was worse. The base had no white paint. None. The supply depot explained that white paint had been reallocated for marking runways. Mackenzie's counterpart, Flight Sergeant Thomas O'Rourke, made a decision that under normal circumstances would have resulted in court-martial. He dispatched a truck to a civilian hardware store in Grantham, 6 miles away. The driver arrived to find the store closed. He jimmied the lock, loaded 4 50-gallon drums of white paint into the truck, and left a requisition form and a £10 note on the counter. The next morning, the store owner called the base to confirm the order. O'Rourke told him the money was sufficient. The owner asked if more would be needed. O'Rourke said he didn't know. The owner said he'd leave the store unlocked. By the evening of June 3rd, the scope of the challenge had become clear to every ground crew chief in southern England. The official estimate of 20 gallons per aircraft was wrong. Actual consumption ran closer to 35 gallons because the paint had to go on thick, applied by men who had no training in coverage rates or brush technique. The paint ran. It dripped. It pooled in panel seams. It dried unevenly. Some aircraft looked professional. Others looked like they had been vandalized. And none of that mattered, because the point was not aesthetics. The point was visibility. Bold, unmistakable, instant recognition from any angle at any distance. A Spitfire with crooked invasion stripes was still instantly recognizable as Allied. A P-47 with paint drips still looked nothing, like a Messerschmitt. The imperfection was irrelevant as long as the pattern was clear. But there was another problem. A problem that would have stopped the entire operation if anyone in command had fully understood it before June 3rd. There was not enough paint in all of Britain to mark every aircraft in 48 hours, not remotely close. The shortage became apparent by midnight on June 3rd. RAF supply depots began receiving urgent requests from bases across southern England. North Witham needed white paint, Tempsford needed black, Biggin Hill needed both, Tangmere, Cologne, Bottisham, dozens of airfields, each with dozens of aircraft, each requiring gallons upon gallons of paint that did not exist in military inventory. The RAF supply system was designed for routine maintenance, not emergency mass application. Standard procedure required requisition forms submitted in triplicate, reviewed by supply officers, approved by commanding officers, processed through depots, delivered on scheduled transport runs. The timeline for that process was measured in weeks. The timeline for invasion stripes was measured in hours. At RAF Supply Depot 14 near Southampton, Supply Officer Captain David Merrick faced a choice. He could follow regulations and watch the invasion fail, or he could ignore regulations and hope the invasion succeeded before anyone audited his books. He chose the latter. Merrick telephoned every civilian paint manufacturer within 50 miles. Benjamin Moore in Portsmouth, Dulux in Reading, local hardware distributors, marine supply companies that stocked deck paint for Royal Navy vessels. He told them what he needed: 200,000 gallons, black and white, delivered to 30 airfields across southern England. By tomorrow evening, he did not mention that he had no authority to make such purchases. He did not mention that military procurement regulations forbade direct civilian contracts without competitive bidding and approval from the War Office. He simply told them this was for the invasion. That was sufficient. The paint companies mobilized. Dulux redirected 3 rail cars of white interior paint destined for civilian housing contracts. Benjamin Moore emptied its warehouses of black marine paint. A company in Bristol that manufactured road-marking paint contributed 40,000 gallons of flat white. None of it met military specifications. All of it was good enough. By dawn on June 4th, trucks began arriving at airfields carrying 50-gallon drums stenciled with civilian manufacturer logos. Ground crews rolled them onto the tarmac, pried open the lids, and got to work. Some crews had received brushes. Most had not. They improvised. Mops, brooms, rags wrapped around boards, mess hall ladles for pouring, anything that could spread paint across aluminum skin. At RAF Station Bottisham, home to the 396th Bomb Group, Master Sergeant Frank Delgado stood beside a B-26 Marauder and realized that standard brushwork would take too long. The bomber's wingspan measured 71 feet. Each wing required 3 white stripes and 2 black stripes, 18 inches wide, running the entire length top and bottom. Calculating coverage, he estimated 6 hours per aircraft working continuously. The squadron had 18 bombers. He had 12 men. The math didn't work. Delgado had grown up in San Antonio, Texas, where his father ran a commercial painting business. Before the war, Delgado had spent summers painting houses, warehouses, industrial buildings. He knew that professionals didn't brush large surfaces, they rolled them. He walked to the motor pool and found the oldest truck on the base, a Bedford 3-tonner with rusted bed panels. He borrowed 4 paint rollers used for marking parking areas. Then he went back to the Marauder and tested his theory. The roller covered surface area 5 times faster than a brush. The paint went on thicker, but it dried faster in the June sun. Within an hour, Delgado had completed 1 wing. 2 hours later, both wings were striped. He moved to the fuselage. The curved surfaces were trickier. The roller slipped, but it worked. By sunset on June 4th, all 18 bombers wore invasion stripes. None of them were perfect. All of them were functional. Word spread. Other squadrons heard about the rollers, about the mops, about the technique of just pouring paint directly onto the wing surface and spreading it with whatever tools came to hand. Orthodoxy evaporated. The only rule that mattered was, get it done. At RAF Tempsford, Sergeant Robert Mackenzie faced a different problem. His C-47 seconds were configured for paratroop drops, which meant their interiors contained anchor cable systems running the length of the cabin. Paratroopers hooked their static lines to these cables. The cables had to remain functional, but they also ran directly beneath the fuselage stripe positions, painting the exterior without paint seeping through. Panel gaps and contaminating the interior mechanism required precision his crew didn't have time for. Mackenzie made a decision. He ordered his men to paint the fuselage stripes first, quickly, accepting that paint would seep through. Then, while the exterior dried, they entered the cabin and cleaned every cable, every connector, every hook with solvent. It added 2 hours to each aircraft, but it guaranteed that when the 82nd and 101st Airborne hooked up on the night of June 5th, their static lines would not jam on dried paint. Not every ground crew chief thought of that. Not every crew had time. On the morning of June 5th, riggers at several bases discovered anchor cables gummed with paint residue. They spent hours scraping, cleaning, testing. Some cables were replaced entirely. The work continued even as paratroopers began arriving for their final equipment checks, but the paint was going on. Everywhere across southern England, aircraft were transforming. Sleek, camouflaged warplanes became striped, instantly recognizable icons. Some looked professional, many looked crude. The paint jobs ranged from meticulous craftsmanship to borderline vandalism. None of it mattered. The pattern was clear. White, black, white, black, white. Unmistakable. At Biggin Hill, ground crews worked through the night of June 4th into the morning of June 5th. By dawn, 87 Spitfires wore invasion stripes. The paint was still wet on some aircraft when pilots climbed into cockpits for pre-flight checks. Squadron leader David Morrison touched his Spitfire's wing and his glove came away white. He didn't care. The stripes meant something more important than dry paint. They meant somebody had learned from Sicily. Morrison had flown combat missions since 1940. He'd watched friends die. He'd seen aircraft explode for reasons that made sense and reasons that didn't. Mechanical failure, enemy fire, navigation error, all of it understandable in the brutal logic of war. But Sicily had been different. Sicily had been murder by confusion. Men killed by their own side because nobody could tell who was who in the chaos. The stripes wouldn't prevent every mistake, but they would prevent that mistake. That one catastrophic, inexcusable error of shooting down your own forces because you couldn't identify them fast enough. Morrison looked at the crude white band wrapped around his Spitfire's fuselage and thought, somebody finally got something right. By the afternoon of June 5th, the impossible had been accomplished. Nearly 12,000 aircraft bore invasion stripes. Not all of them. Heavy bombers were exempt, the Flying Fortresses and Lancasters were too distinctive to confuse with German aircraft. But every fighter, every light bomber, every transport, every glider bore the markings. Thousands of ground crew worked through exhaustion and improvisation, had transformed the Allied air fleet in 48 hours. They had used paint, meant for houses, paint meant for roads, paint meant for ship decks. They had used brushes, mops, rollers, rags, and bare hands. They had violated supply regulations, procurement rules, and probably several articles of military law, and they had saved the invasion. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The test came on the night of June 5th into June 6th, 1944. D-Day, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious assault in human history, and the largest airborne operation ever attempted. At 2300 hours, the first C-47 seconds lifted off from airfields across southern England, pathfinders of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. Their mission was to mark drop zones with radar beacons and lights. Behind them would come the main force, 432 C-47 seconds carrying 13,400 paratroopers. Each aircraft bore invasion stripes still tacky in places, still drying, but unmistakably visible. The flight path took them south over the English Channel, then east toward Normandy. They flew at 500 feet, low enough to avoid German radar, high enough to give paratroopers time to deploy their chutes. As they approached the French coast, the aircraft descended to 300 feet. Jump altitude. Below them, the invasion fleet, 5,000 vessels, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, minesweepers. Every gun crew on every ship had been briefed. They had been shown photographs. They had been told to watch for the stripes. Aircraft with stripes are friendly. Do not fire. Hold discipline. Wait for orders. The C-47 seconds came in from the north. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Their invasion stripes visible even in the pre-dawn darkness, illuminated by the moon, by burning German positions, by the muzzle flash of offshore naval guns pounding beach fortifications. Every aircraft displayed the pattern. White, black, white, black, white, unmistakable, distinct. And the fleet held fire. Not a single shot was fired at Allied transport aircraft during the initial airborne phase of Operation Overlord. Not one. The lessons of Sicily had been learned, the procedures had been implemented, and the invasion stripes worked exactly as intended. Aboard the cruiser HMS Belfast, radar operator Seaman First Class Thomas Whitmore watched the scope as the formations passed overhead. Green blips moving in precise columns. The officer of the watch asked if they should challenge with IFF. Whitmore shook his head. "No need, sir. I can see the stripes from here." The officer looked up through the bridge windows. Even at 500 feet, even at night, the pattern was visible. Distinctive white bands against dark fuselage. The officer nodded. "Carry on." Onshore, it was the same. British and Canadian forces landing at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches watched the transports pass, overhead. American forces at Utah and Omaha did likewise. Anti-aircraft crews tracked the aircraft with their guns but held fire. Everyone had been briefed. Everyone knew what the stripes meant. And everyone remembered what happened when briefings were ignored. The paratroopers jumped into darkness over Normandy. 13,000 men tumbling from aircraft into smoke and chaos. Many landed far from their drop zones. Some landed in flooded fields and drowned. Some landed in trees and were shot by German patrols. Some landed directly on German positions and died before they hit the ground. The airborne assault was messy, scattered, far from the precision planned on maps, but the casualties were from German fire, from bad drops, from the chaos of combat, not from friendly fire. Not from Allied guns shooting down Allied aircraft because nobody could tell who was who. The invasion stripes had prevented that. In doing so, they had saved hundreds, perhaps thousands, of lives. Lieutenant James Dunnigan, pilot of C-47 number 42308, flew his aircraft over Utah Beach at 0030 hours on June 6th. He dropped his stick of paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, then turned back toward England. As he passed over the fleet, he looked down at the ships below. Every deck bristled with guns, every gun was manned, and not one of them fired at him. Dunnigan had flown missions over Sicily. He had watched C-47 seconds explode in mid-air, torn apart by friendly fire. He had seen paratroopers burn as they fell. He had flown home that night through a gauntlet of tracers from his own side, waiting for the shell that would end his life. He had landed in Tunisia, convinced he would never fly another combat mission, that the next time he carried paratroopers, he would be carrying them to their deaths at the hands of their own forces. But this was different. The stripes had changed everything. As Dunnigan crossed the English coast and began his approach to the airfield, he looked at his C-47's wings. The white paint was scorched in places from anti-aircraft fire, German fire. But the stripes were intact, visible, and they had worked. Over the next 3 days, the invasion stripes proved their value again and again. Fighter sweeps over the beachhead, bomber missions against German reinforcements, supply drops to isolated airborne units. Every mission involved aircraft flying over Allied forces. Every mission carried the risk of friendly fire, and in every case, the stripes provided instant identification. There were still mistakes. On June 7th, a Royal Navy destroyer fired on a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts, hitting one aircraft. The pilot survived. Investigation revealed the destroyer's gun crew had been engaging German fighters minutes before and failed to recheck identification before firing. But it was one incident, not a systematic catastrophe. One aircraft damaged, not 23 destroyed. By June 10th, the immediate invasion phase concluded. Allied forces had established a beachhead 50 miles wide and 10 miles deep. The air superiority was absolute, Luftwaffe resistance had been negligible, and the friendly fire incidents that had plagued Sicily never materialized in Normandy. Air Chief Marshal Leigh Mallory reviewed the after-action reports. Aircraft losses from friendly fire during the Normandy operations. 7 aircraft, all from isolated incidents, all survivable. Compare that to Sicily, 23 aircraft destroyed, 37 heavily damaged, 318 casualties. The difference was overwhelming. The invasion stripes had worked, but there was a cost. The stripes made aircraft visible not just to Allied forces but to German forces as well. Aircraft on the ground became easier targets. German reconnaissance could photograph marked aircraft and use the stripes to identify which bases housed which units. By early July, Leigh Mallory ordered the stripes removed from upper surfaces. Aircraft would retain stripes on undersides and fuselages, but the top wing surfaces would be repainted in standard camouflage. This reduced visibility from above while maintaining identification from below. By December 1944, the stripes were removed entirely. The Allies had achieved complete air supremacy over France. German fighters no longer posed a significant threat. The risk of friendly fire had diminished as ground forces became familiar with Allied aircraft types. The invasion stripes had served their purpose. They were no longer needed. But the legacy remained. In the years after the war, the invasion stripes became one of the most recognizable symbols of D-Day. Photographs of C-47 seconds with bold black and white bands, Spitfires and Mustangs wearing the distinctive pattern. They appeared in history books, documentaries, commemorative air shows. The stripes became synonymous with the invasion itself, a visual shorthand for the largest military operation in history. What most people never learned was how close those stripes came to not existing at all. How the order went out just 48 hours before the invasion. How ground crews scrambled to find paint that didn't exist in military inventory. How regulations were violated, procedures ignored, civilian stores broken into, all to get the job done in time. The official histories recorded the stripes as a planned identification measure implemented as part of Operation Overlord security protocols. They made it sound orderly, bureaucratic, as if the decision had been made months in advance and executed according to schedule. The reality was chaos, desperation, improvisation. Men working through the night with whatever tools they could find, applying paint with mops and bare hands, knowing that if they failed, the invasion would begin with Allied forces shooting down Allied aircraft just as they had over Sicily. The men who painted the stripes received no recognition, No medals. No commendations. They were ground crew, mechanics, support personnel, the kind of men whose contribution to war is measured in hours worked and equipment maintained, not battles won or missions completed. When the invasion succeeded, the credit went to the planners who conceived it, the generals who commanded it, the soldiers who fought it. But the invasion succeeded in part because 12,000 aircraft wore stripes painted by men whose names never appeared in any after-action report. Men like Sergeant Robert Mackenzie at Tempsford, who spent 2 days with a mop and a bucket, making sure C-47 seconds were visible enough to keep from being shot down by their own side. Men like Supply Officer Captain David Merrick, who violated procurement regulations to buy 200,000 gallons of civilian paint. Men like Master Sergeant Frank Delgado, who figured out that paint rollers worked better than brushes and shared that knowledge with every squadron within radio range. These were not heroes in the traditional sense. They did not storm beaches or hold bridges or fight to the last round. They painted airplanes, but in doing so, they solved a problem that had killed over 300 men in Sicily. They prevented that disaster from repeating itself over Normandy, and they saved thousands of lives in the process. The story might have ended there, a successful improvisation, a crisis averted. But the invasion stripes revealed something deeper about how the Allied military learned from catastrophic failure. Sicily had been the worst friendly fire incident in American military history. The response could have been scapegoating, courts-martial, blame assigned to individual gunners or commanders. Instead, the response was systemic. Identify the root cause. Develop a solution. Implement it at scale. The root cause was not incompetence. It was not cowardice. It was not malice. It was confusion. In the chaos of combat, with hundreds of aircraft filling the sky, human beings could not reliably distinguish friend from enemy fast enough to prevent mistakes. The solution was not better training or stricter discipline. Those things helped, but they were insufficient. The solution was making the distinction so obvious, so unmistakable, that even exhausted gunners with frayed nerves and seconds to decide could see it instantly. The invasion stripes did that. They transformed a complex identification problem into a simple visual pattern. White, black, white, black, white. If you see stripes, don't shoot. It was crude. It was inelegant. It made aircraft more visible to the enemy. But it worked. That willingness to accept an imperfect solution because it solved the immediate problem was characteristic of Allied command at its best. They did not wait for a perfect system. They did not demand that the solution be aesthetically pleasing or technically sophisticated. They demanded that it work. And when ground crews said they needed 48 hours and whatever, paint they could find, command said, do it. There was another lesson embedded in the invasion stripes story. The people who solved the problem were not the people who created it. The planners who approved the Sicily mission were senior officers, making strategic decisions in headquarters far from the combat zone. The people who painted the stripes were sergeants and corporals working on airfields in southern England. They had no authority to question strategy. They had no input into mission planning. But they had the knowledge and the tools to solve the tactical problem of identification. That pattern repeated throughout the war. Strategic decisions made at high levels. Tactical solutions implemented by low-level personnel. The disconnect between the two often created problems. But when the system worked, when senior command recognized a problem and empowered junior personnel to solve it, the results were remarkable. The invasion stripes were that system working. High command acknowledged the problem. Senior officers approved the solution. Junior personnel executed it with whatever resources they could improvise. Nobody waited for perfect conditions or ideal circumstances. They worked with what they had, and what they had was enough. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Soviet forces were closing on Berlin. The Luftwaffe was destroyed. The Wehrmacht was retreating on all fronts. Victory was inevitable, but the cost had been staggering. Hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties, entire cities destroyed, millions dead across Europe. In that context, the story of the invasion stripes seemed minor, a small technical problem solved by a small technical solution. 300 lives saved, maybe more. Meaningful to those men and their families. Barely a footnote in the larger narrative of the war. But it was more than that, because the invasion stripes represented something essential about how democracies wage industrial war. They innovate from the bottom up. They empower low-level personnel to solve problems using whatever resources are available. They accept imperfect solutions that work over perfect solutions that don't. They learn from catastrophic mistakes instead of repeating them. The Germans did not do this. The Wehrmacht was a highly professional military with excellent tactical doctrine and superb equipment. But it was also rigid, hierarchical, resistant to innovation that came from below. When German forces made mistakes, the response was often punishment rather than problem-solving. That rigidity contributed to their defeat. The Allies made mistakes too, terrible mistakes. Sicily was one of them. But the response to Sicily was not punishment. It was analysis, solution development, and rapid implementation. That pattern of learning from failure and adapting quickly was one of the Allies' decisive advantages. The invasion stripes were a small example of that advantage in action. On June 6, 2000, the 56th anniversary of D-Day, veterans of the Normandy invasion gathered in France for commemoration ceremonies. Among them was Lieutenant James Dunnigan, now 82 years old. He had not flown since the war. He had returned to civilian life, worked as an engineer, raised a family, rarely spoke about his service. But he returned to Normandy for the anniversary. He stood on Utah Beach and looked at the sky. A flyover had been planned. Restored C-47 seconds from museums and private collections, repainted in D-Day markings, including invasion stripes. The aircraft approached from the north, just as they had 56 years before, low and slow, unmistakable. Dunnigan watched them pass overhead. He thought about the night of June 5, 1944, the darkness, the fear, the weight of 13 paratroopers in the cabin behind him, trusting him to get them to the drop zone. The knowledge that his own side had guns, and those guns might fire. And the stripes, the crude, hasty, improvised stripes that had been painted onto his aircraft 36 hours before the mission. Those stripes had saved his life. He was certain of it. If they had not been there, if the fleet below had been forced to rely on IFF or visual identification or simple hope, someone would have opened fire. Maybe not on his aircraft. Maybe not on that mission. But somewhere, somehow, the disaster of Sicily would have repeated itself. Men would have died. The invasion might have failed. Instead, the stripes had worked. They had been visible, unmistakable, and because of that, he had survived. 13 paratroopers had jumped into Normandy. Some of them had died that night. But none of them had died because Allied guns shot down their transport. That was something. That was enough. As the restored C-47 seconds disappeared toward the horizon, Dunnigan thought about the men who had painted those stripes. He had never met them. Never knew their names. They were ground crew, invisible in the machinery of war. But they had done something that mattered. They had taken an order that seemed impossible and made it happen in 48 hours, using paint stolen from hardware stores and tools improvised from mop handles. That was the real story of the invasion stripes. Not the high-level planning or the strategic vision. Not the official memorandums or the command decisions. The real story was sergeants working through the night with paint rollers and determination, making sure that when the bombers and fighters and transports crossed the channel on D-Day, they would be instantly recognizable. That nobody would repeat the mistake of Sicily. That this time, the Allies would get it right. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.